Hello and welcome to our Enriching English webinar. We'll just wait for people to join and then we'll get started. Please do introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like to. Let us know where you're teaching and joining from today. I think our numbers sort of stabilising here, so we'll get started. I'm Kathy Martin, the Commissioning Editor for English at Collins, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce Jo Heathcote and Eleanor White. We're going to be talking about their new series, Enriching English, and what's motivated them to write these books. So Jo Heathcote is a highly experienced English teacher and a consultant, principal for an examination board, and the writer of many textbooks, resources and study guides, which we're lucky enough to publish. Eleanor White is an English subject development lead in initial teacher training, and she guides trainee teachers with research-informed pedagogies. So Jo and Ellie's presentation is going to take about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for a Q&A to take us to 5 p.m. here. The session is going to be recorded, and we'll share the recording with you after the event. And we'd love this to be an interactive session, so if you've got any questions, please do put them in the chat at any point, and Jo and Ellie will answer them at the end. So I'll now hand over to Jo, who's going to introduce the series.
Hi, and thank you, Kathy, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. I'm absolutely fascinated by all the locations actually in the chat. I was completely distracted there. The concept of these books was actually, it's an idea or a seed that has been germinating with me for a little while. Obviously, I've written for Collins for quite a number of years. And it stemmed really from the Reimagine resources that I created for Collins, for students, that the student resources initially, the Reimagine English series for Key Stage 3. And it's long really been an ambition of mine to write something for teachers. And also for aspiring heads of department, for heads of department. And so this has been the opportunity to do that. Much of the content has come from my own experience. Obviously, as you say there, Kathy, I've been teaching for, I think I've done 30 years now in the classroom. So much of the content has come from my own experience, my own observations. Post-COVID, I've been working with a number of schools, a number of departments across the UK mainly, although judging by sort of some of our locations today, it'd be very nice to be able to come and visit you at some point. Obviously working on a consultancy basis, and it's a real privilege when you do go into school on a consultancy basis, because so many observations come to you, so many ideas come to you. And it was through that work really that I recognised the needs really that are currently in school, that the need for help, the need for guidance within departments. Certainly sort of in many of the schools that I've visited over the past few years, there has been quite a difficult situation in terms of recruitment, and retention has been difficult for teachers as well. Many departments have been very, very short-staffed. And I was recognising really how hard many departments were working, how short-staffed they've been. And so it was their needs really that have facilitated this series. One of the observations that I did make is that we've had quite a number of very brave, young, really quite teachers who are quite early in their career have been stepping up to lead departments precisely because of the shortage or the staff shortage at the moment, which I think is really brave to be doing that without the experience. So that again flagged a need for me for the book, that, you know, departments are really up against the wire and there's no time really for departments to have periods of reflection or to step back and to look at the big picture. So that was one of the motivations really for writing the book. also, I think when you are short-staffed and you're trying to recruit subject specialists and you have examination classes, then actually it's key stage 3 that can sometimes take a bit of a hit in terms of your priorities. So one of the things that I really try to do in the curriculum book is to really look at the 5-year journey or the 7-year journey, depending on your setting, and create cohesion across the key stages. Another observation of mine, and this may well just be a pet hate of mine, and it might not gain me any popularity, but is that quite often there has been of late a very big focus on theory in education and not quite enough focus, to my mind, it is a personal feeling, on practice and the practical craft, the practical art of teaching. And I do think that teaching is a craft, is an art. And it was while I was actually discussing that with Ellie over a cup of coffee, one day a Zoom cup of coffee, as they generally are these days, that we actually found some symmetry in the way that we were thinking. And that's really where the concept came from, that suddenly we weren't just thinking one book, we were thinking 2 books. Ellie had some thoughts and some ideas around pedagogy, and so we approached HarperCollins then, obviously, and the 2 books were born. Are you still there, Kathy? Are you still with us?
I am, thank you very much. I wasn't sure if you were going to introduce your books individually first as well. Or should we go straight into the chat?
So over to you, Ellie. Do you want to say a little bit about your intro?
Yeah, of course. Sorry. So my name's Ellie. I've worked in education for 11 years. Was lucky enough to work with Jo, supporting tutors in the classroom, and that's where the ideas for these books sort of were sparked, as Jo said, over some coffees, over Zoom. And mine's really about pedagogy, which is, a pedagogue, which I was called when I left my first teaching job, which I took as a great compliment, and I think you should all be complimented if you're ever referred to as a pedagogue. It's a guide really who uses frameworks to teach well and to teach the best way they can. And I wanted to give teachers time to reflect on what pedagogy is and how to practically apply it, as Jo says, and fall in love with the subject, fall back in love with English, because we do see, A-level rates in the UK anyway are falling, but you see across the world and in the international schools I'm sure that you work in, that retention of teachers isn't high. So there's a real need to nourish that love for the subject, and I think that comes from this time and reflection that you can have to develop your pedagogy in the best way possible, really. And it's very much about the personal response, so a feelings first approach to English. There's a lot of emphasis at the moment on cognitive science and retrieval practice and knowledge, whereas English is really about skills and it's about feelings. And this book really tries to put that at the forefront, to really think about how we can get students to respond personally to the stimulus that we give them, but also for teachers to have that experience as well and love the subject. So I start looking at pedagogy and what it is, but also andragogy, so the science of teaching adults and how to support trainee teachers within your department. So it's quite useful for mentors. Then I look at sort of science of learning and how to remember in the best environment for teaching, and then different pedagogies for oracy, reading and writing. And then there's some exploration of English specific deliberate practice, and then an exploration of wellbeing, which I think is really important, and how to be a reflective practitioner.
Fantastic, thank you, Ellie. And Jo, would you like to introduce your book as well? Yes.
Sure. So again, as I've mentioned already, Mine is really about looking at the big picture. It's about curriculum planning. It's about perhaps aimed more at heads of departments or aspiring heads of departments or leaders in any way within departments, perhaps key stage leaders. So I look at sort of the whole picture of what English curriculum is, how to take your students on a journey through that curriculum, how to build your curriculum, how to enrich it. Obviously, you can see there from the chapter headings, we look at text choices. The lost art of lesson planning that's a real sort of subject that's close to my heart, is the idea of creation of schemes of work and enriching resources. And I do think that is something that has been lost to a certain degree over the past few years. Particularly, to me, that's part of the joy of teaching, is the creation of resources. And that's certainly something that I really enjoy coaching in and working with departments in, is actually bringing that joy back and that ownership into resources. So that's a really important chapter. Obviously, we've got a chapter on assessment in here as well, and some adventurous ideas at the end as Ellie says, bring the love back really for English, which, we are seeing declining numbers at A level. We are seeing university departments, sadly reducing their numbers, and that's something that we'd really like to tackle head on via this series, really.
Fantastic, thank you, Jo. And we're going to sort of take a closer look at each of the books now. So I'm just going to ask Ellie a few questions about her book. So Ellie, you said just now that oracy is a really important focus in the book. Why do you think that is?
I think oracy is so important because it's how we start to communicate, and it's through our skills of oracy that we develop thought, and we can think in a much deeper way, and we remember what we think. So it's really important that we give students that opportunity to think and to process information. It also supports us in reading because we become much better practiced in our questioning and probing of ideas. We're able to discuss text and discuss stimulus within the classroom and be more inferential in our reading through oracy. And it also gets us ready for writing, so it allows us to discuss our ideas but also rehearse what we might write. But so often, even though it's this gateway to developing all the skills in English, it's so often bypassed. I work as a teacher trainer, and I've got a cohort of trainees who I observe in the classroom, and they very, very often have lessons without any structured talk at all. I think they're quite fearful of how to do it and how to do it well. Lots of schools don't encourage it quite so much. I think there's lots going on abroad. I've worked in the Middle East, and there's been lots of focus on debates and making sure that students have that opportunity to speak well, but it needs a bit more work, I think. And I was really passionate that it should be the first sort of main chapter in the book, because we start sort of communicating through listening, and I think this is a really important but quite complex skill. Sometimes we hear things that aren't said, sometimes we hear abstract ideas in literal statements, so we kind of infer when we listen. And I was quite inspired. I used to work in China in schools with foreign language departments that would have a listening framework. So scaffolding the listening experience is really important. So giving students the scaffold of preempting what they might hear. So we're going to listen to something on this topic. What kind of things do you think might be heard? It's really important. And then I move on to talk, which is really empowering for students. It's kind of 98% of my job, I would say. I think today, we're presenting verbally as teachers in our classrooms, that our ability to talk well is essential. And it's really interesting that there's so much now in therapy of talking therapy. So the ability to articulate yourself well through speech can actually make you healthier. So I think we have a responsibility to make sure that students leave school with that craft of being able to articulate themselves, sort of arm them with that proficiency is a really powerful thing.
Thank you, that's fascinating. And sort of on a related point, you talk a lot about dialogic teaching in the book. Could you elaborate on what this is and why you think it's so vital for English?
Yeah, so I think it's really to really support that oracy and having that within the classroom, having a dialogic climate, I call it in the book, is essential. So dialogic means through words, so anything that kind of includes discussion, allowing students to reason, questioning, elaboration of ideas and debate. And Alexander neologized the term in the early 2000s, so he brought it about, and it's the development of ideas through talk. And the book sort of looks at how to sort of structure that. There's I call it a pedagogical schema, so a sort of model for oracy and how to structure it well in the classroom. And I look at learning talk, so students to student talk, and how important that is and how we might scaffold that appropriately. But also teaching talk, so wherever the teacher is involved, so maybe didactically instructing or dialogically engaging with the students. And think about the joy as well of dialect. You know, there's lots of people from lots of fascinating places here, and we've all got our own heritage and our own background, and that joy of identity and how that can come through talk and through how we articulate ourselves. There's a little activity within the book of Liz Berry's lovely poem called Homing, which thinks about the joy of identity. It's just been added to the curriculum, which is really, really promising. And then a dialogic classroom has questioning, so there's a nice questioning matrix to layer your questioning and develop discussion of ideas through questioning, and group roles with sort of, you know, structure for group discussion with explicit non-negotiables, so having rules in place that are really clear. And then I love debate. I think it's really important to allow students time to debate, so there's some ideas for how to structure different debates in a really sensitive way, in a safe way for students. So all of this works together to make a dialogic classroom.
Thank you so much. And I noticed that you talk about the book having a practical application. So could you say a little bit more about that for us, please?
Yeah, so it's very much a lot of what Jo was saying, you know, not sort of focusing so much on theory, but thinking about practice and how can I actually use this information in my day-to-day as a teacher. And that was really important for the books to be usable. There's lots of books out there, particularly in English, with lots of theory, and there's quite interesting viewpoints, but there's not much opportunity to think about how do I practically apply that. So we wanted to make sure that wasn't the case, and it was new information, and then this is how it might look in your classroom, and here's a task that you can do now that will support your planning. So you could almost have this book open with your planning for the next day. There's opportunities to think about sort of drafting and redrafting and writing, and how you might support students with that with a specific task. I introduced sort of live modelling as an idea, and think about scripting your think aloud, so what you would say while you're modelling the response to the students, and then the space in the book to plan your own, so you could take that straight into the classroom and practically apply the new material. And chapter 6 is all about practical application, so how to do that, a kind of adaptation of deliberate practice, which is quite popular at the moment, but in an English specific context. So skills that are really English specific and strategies from the books that will implement those skills. So it's a really impactful way to develop automaticity in the English classroom.
Fantastic, thank you. And I noticed that you've included a feature on reflection in the books. Can you say a little bit about why you think reflection is so important, especially for new teachers, but perhaps for all teachers?
Yeah, I think for all teachers, it's really important to spend time reflecting, sort of key to developing as a teacher, I would say. And we were really keen that both books would have opportunities to reflect throughout. So whenever there's a new idea or a new concept explored, there's an opportunity to reflect, and that's structured with specific questions to support your reflection. So things like I might introduce reciprocal reading as a strategy to structure group talk, and then there's time to think about how could this be applied to your classroom, but also what do you think the limitations to the approach might be, and how might you mitigate those within your context, because it's very different for all of us. So really important to be able to digest each element of the book and think about how it might work, what might need to be adapted and changed. And there's a bit about reflection in the final chapter as well, and how to reflect just generally on your practice, which I think is so important. You know, you might take my ideas about oracy being really important and have some group work in your classroom, but it might go quite badly, and you might reflect on your own, I'm never going to do that again, I'm not a very good teacher, and that's it. But if you actually reflect through different perspectives and you use Brookfield's lenses, that there's a structure to do within the book, you can think about the students and how they experienced the group activity, and maybe they weren't aware of expectations. You can ask a colleague, so you can talk to a mentor and say, what went wrong here? You didn't have any success criteria, they didn't have any explicit rules for what they were doing. And then theory, you might look in chapter 3 in my book, where it says make sure the non-negotiables are really explicit to students. And suddenly that group work going wrong isn't your fault, and you just didn't know that you needed that structure. And you can be persistent, and you can make sure that you keep up with oracy. So reflection makes you more persistent, which improves practice.
That's really fascinating. And do you have a particular way that you encourage people to record their reflections, or way?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's nice to have a journal. There's a journal template in the book which gives you space for reflection. It's nice to be able to read back, so to keep them somewhere. You know, lots of teachers have teacher planners, so just some reflections at the end of the day, at the end of the week, in your teacher planner could be really good.
I guess fascinating to look back and see how things went last year compared to this year.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And you said this book is particularly aimed at sort of new and trainee teachers, but would it also support mentors as well?
Yeah, so there's lots in there, I think, for mentors. I mean, it's definitely written with new teachers in mind, so it introduces pedagogies for reading, writing and oracy as if you haven't sort of ever explored those before. So it could be revisiting things that you might know, but I think the exploration of andragogy and how to support adult learners is really useful for mentors, and looking at how deliberate practice might work in an English classroom, so that practical application of skill could really support mentors and maybe new heads of department leading teams, and also thinking about how to break down concepts for newer teachers. I think it would be really useful for more experienced teachers as well.
Brilliant. And finally, your last chapter, as you said, is on wellbeing. Why did you choose to end the book in that way?
I think it's just an essential part of being a happy teacher, and the books, you know, were about heart and soul back into the subject and enriching English. And I think you can't feel enriched and you can't deliver an enriching curriculum without having that love and that passion for the subject, and in order to do that you need to look after yourself, and you know, it's often a forgotten element. I definitely forgot about it early in my career. I had a really difficult time, and I really wish someone had told me, you know, to protect time for your well-being, and to make sure that it's appropriate to you as well. It's a very personal thing, and there's sort of ways of exploring the why, so what's actually going wrong, and getting to the root of the problem. You know, quite often people will tell you, you know, have a peppermint tea, go to a yoga class, and it's not necessarily going to work for you. So thinking about what's going to make you a much better teacher, and what's going to give you that space, but also what's going to make you happy in your personal life, which is really important. And really for teachers, it's time. They need more time. Teachers are generally exhausted. So the last chapter sort of thinks about how can we carve out more time for ourselves, and there's the journal template that I spoke about to sort of prioritize all of your tasks and needs, to give you that space to really think about yourself and nourish yourself, so that you can be there for your students and strong for your students as well. And I think that's how you can sort of teach with heart. And I ended the book with a little meditation to sort of reflect back on, there's a poem in there to really think about what we love about English, because we all became English teachers because we love the subject, and just give yourself that time to reflect back on it. And I think it's just, wellbeing is just as important as oracy or reading or writing, so it needed its own chapter.
Thank you, Ellie. That's a great note to end on, I think. And we're going to now dive into Jo's book, Curriculum with Soul. So Jo, you talk a lot about planning. So what kind of strategic decisions do you think teachers face when they're designing an English curriculum for their school?
Well, I mean, to be in a position where you can design an English curriculum, I think is a great privilege anyway. You know, it is a core subject. As Ellie said, it's a subject that we really love. So I think, you know, there is a great deal of responsibility there as well, particularly, you know, for the secondary curriculum. For me, and particularly what I advocate in the book, is it's about having the big picture, and seeing that journey across your 5 years or across your 7 years, depending on your setting. For me personally, I always think it's a bit of a mistake to see the key stages as separate entities. So I like to think about it as a whole cohesive journey. I think we've got, you know, that chapter on the cohesive journey, the spiral of the curriculum. And for me, sort of that what we're advocating in terms of the structure of the book is to, when you're planning your curriculum, begin at the end. Think, where's the end point of our journey? And then how do we spiral back to the point at which our students come in year 7? So not just spiraling in terms of content, but also spiraling in terms of skills, in terms of English skills. So everything is a stepping stone through that English journey. Ellie has mentioned that we've tried to make this very practical. We don't want this to be the kind of book for teachers where you nod off. We just do not want that at all. We want this to be where you're actually interacting with the book itself. So we do have those periods of reflection. We do have little tasks to do right the way through, a chance for you to jot things down, gather ideas as you go. And so particularly in mine, I think there's the opportunity there to maybe use some of those tasks with your department. If you're a department leader or a key stage leader, it's things that you can work on together and collaboratively through the book. So those little takeaways at the end of the chapter are there to sort of you know, keep the excitement burning, I guess, really, and stimulate thought and help you to think about, oh, what's possible in my department. I could do that, or maybe I could do it this way, or I could do it that way, just to stimulate the thought, really. As you know, Kathy, obviously, you know, we've worked together. I've written resources for you for many years. And my strategy has always been simplicity. Keeping it very, very simple, keeping the curriculum simple. You know, it's hard enough. It's hard enough. And, you know, I can see we've got colleagues on the call today who are teaching under very, very difficult circumstances. You know, let's not make things difficult for ourselves in the English classroom. Let's not make things difficult for our students. Certainly in some of the departments that I've visited over time, I see some amazing English curriculum that I think, my goodness, these could be degree courses. There's so much packed in there. I mean, they do look amazing. But one of the questions that I asked one school recently, I said, gosh, this looks fantastic, but how on earth do you get through it? How do you get through this in the time? And the head of department said to me, well, actually, we don't get through it all. That's why you're here, Jo. That was one of the reasons that they'd had lots and lots of amazing ideas, but couldn't really harness it into a cohesive curriculum. So that is one of my main messages, I think, in the book is, can we make things logical? Can we make things simple? But also at the same time, can we bring back the enjoyment, embed the skills, embed the knowledge, but not lose the heart of the subject while we're doing that.
Fantastic, thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about the importance of making choices of text when you're designing a curriculum?
So certainly sort of that is another chapter of the book, is about text choices. As you know, Kathy, obviously, I think we've worked together for about 15 years, haven't we now, on resources, and you'll know that I'm very text led when I'm creating resources, because I do think that's the stuff that inspires us, isn't it, as teachers? It's the thing that inspires our creativity. It's the bedrock of most of our planning. It's the thing that I think brings the creative element to the English curriculum. I went back into the English classroom having worked for a major exam board on the revised specifications, and I've worked sort of on UK specifications, I've worked on international specifications, but in the UK, it was interesting sort of with the UK specifications that when the spec changed, there was a lot of anxiety around 19th century texts, and 19th century texts becoming part of the requirement on English language. We don't have that obviously on international qualifications, but we do have 19th century texts on international literature. So there is still that, that challenge and that complexity there. But certainly I feel that in some of the curriculums that I've looked at in schools, things have been pushed a little bit too far, that there is a real heavy weighting of 19th century and classic texts, as if really they're the only texts that matter, that it has to be, old to be good. We've tended to see, particularly post-COVID, with the gaps in learning, we've had students coming into secondary really with quite low reading ages, with gaps in their learning. And for me, I would see that as a mistake, to have those students who are maybe not confident readers then being given, a 19th century text to deal with in year 7. I would say, to my mind, I think that's crazy. There are so many brilliant writers out there of young adult fiction that I think has equal value. And I think that's the way to get your students involved. One of the things I advocate is kicking off every year with a modern prose fiction text. So as your class reader for year 7, year 8, year 9. Don't get me wrong, I love teaching romantic poetry, I love teaching Dickens, I love teaching Austen, I love teaching Blake, but I do think that we should not neglect the brilliant talent that is young writers today and writers for young people today. So even one of my tasks is actually, for a department to do, or for people to do as an individual or an aspiring head of department to do, is go into your local bookshop. What brilliant young adult fiction can you see there? What can you find there? Who's winning the awards for young adult fiction? What is brilliant at the moment? And who's writing for the age groups that you teach, that you represent? Who's writing to represent your pupils culturally? What is going on with what's out there that they can tap into?
Thank you, Jo. And I suppose related point, how can teachers and leaders in English help to make the curriculum more diverse and more representative of the young people that they're teaching?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly diversity has been on the agenda, hasn't it, of late? It's been, sort of something that departments have been working on. It's certainly something that exam boards have been working on. I do think it's a work in progress. I don't think it's really happening as quickly as we'd like to see. We have seen some moves from examination boards. It's important there to think, well, though those texts are on offer, will we see the uptake within the schools with those less familiar texts? Obviously, there are lots of concerns there. There are budget concerns maybe for departments as to whether they're able to replace examination texts. I think it links back to what I was saying in the introduction about creating schemes of work, because when you diversify your curriculum, if you're bringing new texts in, then you need to resource that as well. So what we were speaking about earlier in terms of creating schemes of work, if you bring in a new class reader for year 7, it requires a body of work around it. The same for year 8. So that is part and parcel of the coaching that we do within the book, is to think about creating new schemes of work as well. I think there is a wealth of poetry out there that you can tap into very easily. Certainly, sort of in the past couple of years, you and I, Kathy, we've worked on the Who We Are and Through Our Eyes anthologies, and we're just partway through, aren't we, finishing off the one for Key Stage 5. And certainly when we were gathering texts for those anthologies, those diverse anthologies, which are diverse in terms of culture, in terms of faith, in terms of sexuality, in terms of neurodiversity, we struggled, didn't we, to limit what we could put in there. There were going to be, anthologies of 24 texts. We were actually overwhelmed with choice as to what we could put in there. So it's not that there isn't material out there. It's, I think, empowering colleagues to be a little bit more adventurous and to work with those texts, for sure. Certainly, for me, I think there's some exciting poetry that's coming onto the agenda, but right across the specifications, I do feel there is a missed opportunity at times, particularly when you see the same text cropping up on 2 or 3 different specifications. You think, oh, come on, let's be a bit more adventurous here. But certainly within our own classrooms, we definitely can be.
Fantastic. And Jo, when you were planning for your own school, did you kind of choose text specifically for the students that you were teaching? I'm just thinking of the mix of cultures you might have, or perhaps international colleagues, the mix of nationalities.
Yes, I mean, for sure. And sometimes things come from the students themselves. I mean, that was very interesting, for me when I mean, certainly sort of in the sixth form college that I taught in was very much a multicultural college, central Manchester. Then I've taught in a all girls, all Islamic environment, which is, very different. And students there who had only recently arrived into the UK from abroad, so there were, language issues there. But I think that then there's a real opportunity to work with that and be adventurous with that, and the students for me are the adventure. And I think it's really important sometimes that I'm white, I'm a teacher, to work in a multicultural environment, you have to learn from your students and bring the text in and hand it over to them. And actually that I would find very rewarding when I was teaching A-level in a very multicultural sixth form college. I could bring a text in and the ideas would come from the students. They would teach me. And it's sometimes, I think it's with experience that you maybe have that confidence to think, oh, I don't need to have a PowerPoint and have all the answers here. I could just have the text and open it up to my students and see where they go with it. So for sure, I found that rewarding. Yeah.
That's an inspiring thought. And sort of thinking beyond GCSE and IGCSE, obviously in England we've seen concern about candidate numbers for A-level dropping in recent years. So what are the barriers that you're finding in schools to students studying one of the Englishes at A-level?
A-level. And I think it's interesting that, obviously we've got colleagues from international colleagues with us today, a lot of international colleagues. It'd be really interesting to find out what's happening with A-level, in some of your locations, if there is, if you're seeing similar things to what we're seeing in the UK at the moment. To do A-level English, for me, you have to love the subject. I think, there's a lot of reading involved. You have to have an absolute love for the subject. And because we've seen that drop in numbers, quite significant drop in numbers over the past few years, then I think we have to question what is going on at Key Stage 4, what's going wrong at Key Stage 4, that students are losing that love for the subject. I think that's one of the things that we need to evaluate and look at. I mean, certainly as well, there is a practical element, the cost of studying, the cost of doing a degree. Perhaps students want something that is an obvious career choice or a practical career choice. Because I think there is a false belief, I do think it's a false belief, that studying English doesn't lead you into a definite career. And actually, I think studying English empowers you with, the critical thinking skills, communication skills, the oracy that Ellie was talking about so beautifully before. Just the perception of what we do with English, I think, needs to change. I think we need to do our PR better as a subject, because, I think I've put a line at one of the openings to the book. I quote my own English teacher from obviously very many decades ago, who said, she used to say, there's all human life in an English lesson. And I fundamentally believe that English is not just it's not just reading and writing, it's sociology, it's psychology, it's politics, it's history, it's everything bound up within that lesson. If you think about the journeys you can go on when you're talking about any text or any poem, then it's all human life, and it's a really important subject to defend.
Well, it's fantastic that it's got you and Ellie to defend it. And finally, you've got a chapter on assessment in your book, and just wondered what you were hoping to show teachers with that chapter.
Yes, I mean, it seems a bit odd, doesn't it, to have a chapter on assessment, because we kind of do it all the time. That's the whole thing with English, isn't it, is, my goodness, the marking. We all realise that on day one of our teacher training courses in English, like, oh my goodness, what have I signed up to here? But actually much of my career has also been involved in assessment with a different hat on, obviously with different examination boards. So much assessment happens in school, it's really part and parcel of the job. But it does surprise me sometimes that on particularly through teacher training, there's not really a great deal that's known about the fundamentals of assessment. In some cases, it's almost like things have been a little bit hidden, or there's been a bit of gatekeeping around assessment. And certainly when the new specifications were launched and I was going around, delivering training, things came to light for me when the specifications were changed, as to just understanding the fundamentals of how mark schemes work, how grading works, and so on. And particularly, I think it was obvious when we were going through COVID and teacher assessment was happening, that you could tell that quite a number of departments have been quite disempowered, and perhaps there was room there for more coaching, for more understanding, and more training in assessment. So within the book, we don't just look at sort of how mark schemes work, but how they work is fundamental. And I think that's a really important thing for heads of department to work with their teams. And we look at that sort of within the book. you know, how to run your mock exam successfully to get the most stable data out of it. How do you do your marking across the team? Just interesting that, you know, some of the international centres that are with us today will still have the luxury of coursework. In the UK, you know, for the main specifications, we don't. And so the difference between the examined components and coursework components, the difference between standardising and moderating is very often blurred, and people don't understand the difference between the two. So I think the need was there to really upskill departments and make them feel really confident about their assessments and not on their back foot, you know, in terms of preparing students and understanding grading and so on. I think it's really important.
Well, thank you so much, Jo. That was fascinating. So we've got, I think, 15 minutes left now. So it's an opportunity for anyone to ask Jo and Ellie a question if they'd like to, perhaps have some discussion between us. I can see we've got one question already in the Q&A. So Ellie, I know you've answered it there, but perhaps you could answer it for everyone else here. So one teacher has asked, what are your ideas for increasing self-esteem of the students in the classroom? Because they seem to be too shy while having online classes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is such a great question. Thank you so much. You know, it really has had an impact on classrooms, being online for so long and being back together physically is really, really difficult. So it's really important to think about this. And I think I say in the pedagogy book that performance is essential, but it doesn't have to be performance in front of absolutely everyone in the classroom. It can be in small groups. You know, that can be a really great thing for students to do, because it's really scary. Sometimes even just answering a question in class can be quite intimidating for them. So small groups and I think really supporting students with oracy instruction with specific roles within those groups. So they've got really specific things that they need to do. So they've got success criteria to fulfill that can help them feel maybe less self-conscious and sort of more clear on what they need to do themselves. Maybe if a student is particularly shy or unable to speak, they could be the person that's checking that everybody's on task and that the success criteria is being fulfilled for the group. Maybe they could be the questioner and they're given specific questions already to make sure that they're engaged. And I think what I've put is a sort of graduated practice, so starting small, giving them lots of positive feedback and then maybe sort of elevating their role a little bit to be a little bit more sort of more performance maybe into their role, and also acknowledging with groups that we've been online and this is how we're feeling and this is how we're impacted, and teachers are the same, and maybe sharing some strategies of how you as a teacher have overcome that could be really useful.
Thank you. That's really tangible answer to that question. We've got a couple of other interesting questions. So Faith Huggins has asked in the chat, do you believe creativity can be assessed? And if so, how? Or how should we even? So Jo, I might throw that one to you.
Oh, thanks. Yes, it is a great question, actually, because how do you assess creativity? I mean, Faith, one of the things that I find really difficult about exam English is the fact that quite often students are asked to do a piece of creative writing against the clock, and I kind of have issues with that. I've got issues about all sorts of things, but I've got issues about that in the sense that, you know, that kind of, can you match it against a mark scheme, and so on. You can match a piece of writing against a mark scheme. Obviously you can, because the mark scheme is a set of success criteria in itself, and you do see different levels of skill and different levels of accomplishment, I would say, as you move through. But I do think that there is room for creativity in lots of different ways. I don't think you can escape from trying to assess any kind of creative piece that your students are working on, but I think it's about valuing them as much as assessing them. I think it's making space for everybody's creativity. I mean, you know, I was lucky enough that in my last school, I had my own classroom. Not everybody's lucky enough to have their own classroom. And so part and parcel of it was always display for me. And I actually talk about display in the book, that the idea that everybody can have their work out and on view. So things like, for example, when I'm discussing a character in a play, I might set something like mask making rather than just writing about the character. So I think that, you know, that gives different opportunities to people with different skills. Whereas somebody might be able to write a great response to a character question, everybody could do a bit of cutting and sticking, you know, and design something, and everybody can have the opportunity to have things on the wall. So I think that, you know, there are different ways of measuring creativity, but make the opportunity for it and value it all is what I would say realistically.
Thank you. Got a flood of questions coming in now. So Ayola has said, considering the short timing of an examination, should we focus on helping new teachers to learn the content of the curriculum, or just channel them towards mastering how to make students successful in the examination? Quite a big one to answer there.
It is a big one. Do you want me to take that one, Ellie? I don't know what the next one is, but maybe you yes, I think the next one's about reflection. So maybe I'll do this one and then you do the next one, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine.
Ayola, I think that students are only successful in examinations when your new teachers are confident with the content. So actually, I think the one leads into the other. And I think just knowing the specification is not enough to enable the students to be successful. So I think it has to be subject knowledge. The more that you're able to increase the subject knowledge, the more that you're able to embed the content of the curriculum, it makes them more successful in delivering examination success. So for me, I think I talked about the spiral earlier on, that to my mind, you teach the skills, you teach those basic skills of comprehension, of analysis, you teach the writing skills lower down school. And this is something that I've done in a lot of schools where I've been in to do consultancy. Embed those skills lower down. And when you come to Key Stage 4, when you come to delivering your exam syllabus, you can enjoy it. You're not then training students to answer questions in an exam. You've embedded skills in year 7, 8, and 9 that enable them to answer those questions anyway in Key Stage 4. And so what they have to do then, what they're doing in Key Stage 4 is perfecting skills that they have already around the content of the Key Stage 4 course. So that would be, I think the one thing leads to the other. So I do think it's subject knowledge and content first.
Fantastic, thanks, Jo. And we've got a couple of questions from Aisha. So the first one, Ellie, I think you're going to take on. So she says, I also believe that incorporating the heart into pedagogy and the soul into curriculum is a crucial aspect of English education. However, could you please share some practical strategies or specific activities that you found to be effective when infusing those elements into your teaching practices? It'd be really interesting to hear a personal anecdote on how something has been implemented and how you reflected on the effectiveness of it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aisha. So I think when when teaching writing, I think it's really, really popular to have scaffolds for students, have sort of writing frames, acronyms. I don't know about internationally. I think internationally as well, A Forest is very popular. We've got Peel for analytical writing, and sharing models quite early in the writing process. And I was cringing talking to a colleague the other day about when I was literacy coordinator very early in my career, and I came up with all these acronyms for different subjects that were related to the subject. So I had atom in science and thought I was being really clever, but was just ruining the writing experience probably for students. And I think I was introduced to free writing by a more experienced colleague. So giving students freedom to write without parameters, firstly. So not sort of telling them what's successful, and giving them that opportunity to write in a free sense, and really let them be creative and let them think about their own response to whether it's a picture or some lines of poetry or whatever stimulus you're giving them. Give them that time to free write. And that's something that I will always do now, because it really allows students to think creatively for themselves, and they're not constricted by these specific techniques that they need, as you talk about, Aisha, there, show, don't tell, and using them very mechanically and not having any feeling to them. You'll find that they do that quite naturally, particularly if they read a lot, and encouraging them to read as much as possible and experience different genres, experience different ways of reading. And then you'll find that free writing is probably the best way to get them to write from the heart. So I think that would be my activity that I found brought a lot of love back into the subject.
Thank you. And Jo, I don't know if you had anything to add.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Aisha's other question and Subhendu's point there about then, but we do still need the clarity and coherence. So it's striking that balance, isn't it, between the two? So I agree totally with what Ellie's said there. I can see Aisha's point about that, when they kind of go overboard and get really, I think, sort of a thesaurus-itis, I would call it, in a way where, we've got every possible synonym and adjective thrown at it. I think Ellie's right in the sense of using lots of different stimulus, but also I think it comes from the reading as well. I think modelling beautifully written texts within your classroom and having experience of beautifully written text. And that's why I think, to have, to use new writing as well is very, very important, so that people can see what makes good writing. It is really important. I think there is an oral element to it as well. So some of the things that I've done myself in the classroom is when you create a piece of writing, it's about reading it aloud as well. So again, to get that clarity, yourself when you're reading a student's piece of work and you stumble over it and you have to go back and read bits of it again. But if students get used to having maybe a buddy in the classroom that they're comfortable with, and they read that piece of work aloud, they find those stumbling moments themselves, because quite often students are much more confident orally in the way that they speak. They recognise and they find each other's mistakes like no danger. So actually to gain the clarity there that you're looking for, and to gain that, as you're saying there, yes, absolute, the brevity as well, that ability to be concise, to be clear, to not use 1,000 words where 10 will do. I'm not making a very good example of that right at this present moment, am I? But to be able to do that, I think, is a lesson in itself. And sharing good examples from peers as well, I think works really well. I was tutoring a friend's son, as you often get asked to do that, don't you, as an English teacher. I was tutoring a friend's son recently, and so I kept one of his examples and used it in one of the masterclasses that I was working with an academy chain. And I just like, thank you, Ishmael. And here's Ishmael's response to this task that you've all been working on. And a student said, is that all we have to do? Is that enough? And actually, it was kind of a light bulb moment for them that they didn't have to write in the exam and write themselves out of marks because they'd become incoherent and rambling. But they recognised, actually, by being shown a good example of a peer who had written to time and completed the same task, that they could, they didn't have to write forever to be good at writing. Less is more. Less was more for them, and that was quite a valuable lesson, I think, there.
Oh, thank you so much, Jo. Well, I think we have got more questions, but I think we've reached 5 o'clock now, so we might draw things to a close, and perhaps see if we can answer some of these in some blogs and things following on from the webinar. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Jo and Ellie for their presentation today, and to all of you for coming along and joining the discussion. It's been fascinating. So the recording of the session will be sent out to everyone who's attended today, and you'll all also be entered into a prize draw to win a copy of both of the books. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you again for another English webinar soon. Thanks.